Hi and welcome to Donor Symposium Diversity Day presentation. My name is Marie Perry. I am a current Doctor of Philosophy candidate with QUT. My presentation today is called Blood, Understanding Thoughts, Feelings and Beliefs Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander peoples have about blood, blood donation and blood transfusions. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners. As an Anawan and Wiradjuri woman, I acknowledge the Turrbal and Yuggera peoples as the First Nations owners of the lands on which I am situated. I pay my respects to the elders, laws, customs and creation spirit. So why this topic? So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have never had this opportunity. They've never been asked before, and there are no guidelines for health providers that relate to Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples about blood donation or blood transfusions. My hope is that by understanding this issue that we can help to lower the gap in life expectancy. We could also increase cultural safety for patients when they're accessing healthcare services. Literature review about my project. Currently there's minimal literature out there. There's few references in accounts from anthropologists and also ethnographers, but there's actually no literature around blood transfusion or donation for First Nations or Indigenous peoples around the world. So other than the Navajo Indians, and that's on the next slide. So the United Nations have a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples in Article 15, which as it states here, they can have their information reflected in education and public information. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be given the opportunity to have their thoughts, feelings and beliefs about blood, blood donation and blood transfusion as public information if they would like. And so this could help make their accessing healthcare much more culturally safe for them. I have had anecdotal conversations with people about this topic, and some people have said that they know someone who has refused to accept a transfusion and then subsequently died, which is an extremely terrible outcome for anybody, but also for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia. So Navajo peoples and their cultural beliefs about blood. They've spoken to a researcher about how they feel about blood transfusions. They believe they need to preserve the lineage and kinship of their families, so they prefer not to accept any blood that's from a non-Navajo person. They also believe that all bodily fluids have a continual linkage to the person that they originated from. So, as I've said here, well, this is actually out of Schwartz and her discussions with them, that if a Navajo person receives a blood transfusion, then if that person dies and they're not a Navajo person, their person's spirit will haunt that transfusion recipient. They also do have some spirit cleansing ceremonies that they've undertaken. This doesn't always work, so they prefer not to have transfusions if they can avoid it. So health services around the world have guidelines for patients such as Jehovah's Witness if they require a blood transfusion. So prior to probably the last couple of years, members of this religion had been instructed they weren't allowed to receive blood or blood product transfusions. There's certainly been discussions that I've heard that if an elder of the church is present, that they may approve a transfusion and the person won't be excommunicated from the church. So in 2014, there was a ruling or how the person that founded the Jehovah's Witnesses had said that if a person had a transfusion, they will be excommunicated from their community and jeopardize their eternal life. So this is well known in medical services, especially in hospitals. So I'm not sure how much Indigenous history that people have been exposed to, hopefully more than that previously was out there in the space. So people know that prior to 1788, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples lived without the fear of colonisers, and they certainly didn't have a fear of being killed or taken from their land. After 1788, there were many massacres. These killed numerous Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, despite the British government advising those who were on the ships that they should make friends with the natives. In 1897, there was a legislation enacted in Queensland and other states that allowed the forced removal to missions and reserves away from their families and children. There were also horrible names that were used to identify Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So they were called half-castes, quadroons, octoroons, and some of these names still can be heard today. The last mission, though, in Queensland or in Australia that closed was Wujal, which is in northern Australia, and that closed in 1987. So it's not that long ago that we still had these things occurring. There were many research projects that were undertaken in missions, and often people were forced to participate. There was no consultation with people who were part of the missions. I've spoken with people who were given vaccinations as guinea pigs, in their words. They had no idea what the vaccination was for. So it's very distressing for the history of Australia to hear these stories. So these were two pictures that I've also been able to locate. So quite distressing to realise that these were actually out there in that space for people to see. It's horrid. And so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been identified as the most researched in the world. The research was always carried out on people, not with or as collaboration with Aboriginal people. There was little to no consultation, as I said previously. Most research certainly didn't help to improve their lives. They just wanted to do a lot of measurements to see where Aboriginal people actually seem to appear from in some kind of weird concept that it was just bizarre that you would expect to measure the intelligence of someone from their skull size after they've died by putting sand in it. So yeah, very, very different research protocol. Certainly no ethics used in those sorts of research projects. So these kind of things have really contributed to the reluctance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their families to think about participating in research, because it just it's a scary thought that people want something from you, but they've taken a lot of things from you, such as your family or your land where you lived, where you were brought up, where you feel at home. So things like biobanking and medical research, there are some reasons here that people have identified that they wouldn't, the reasons why they choose not to participate. So a lack of understanding of cultural perspective of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and therefore they don't feel that they should need to participate, especially if they feel the researchers don't have an understanding of the way that they view the world. So it also may not be a priority at the time for the community. There's so many issues, health issues happening, and certainly a lot of other issues like housing, which leads to numerous health issues as well. So it could be that the community don't see what the research is happening as a priority. So it's difficult for them to be able to encourage members in their community to participate if there's certainly other things that they could be participating in or helping to improve. So they also want the ownership of the information. So Indigenous people want their ownership and recognition of being collaborators with the researchers, not just providing a sample and then not receiving any acknowledgement or education, I would say, career expansion for them as well, to understand how or what this research is going to be used for. And so it's another issue that needs to be looked at, and there are certainly Aboriginal lawyers who are looking at these kinds of things to work out ways that research can be undertaken or collaborated with Indigenous people to produce meaningful results that actually change the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which currently it's really difficult to translate research into that. So probably some people may know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have an interconnectedness of life. So that encompasses their whole body, their spirit, their mind, and the land that they come from, known as what some people would say on country. So there's an interconnectedness to bodily substances as well. So some mobs will, like I said here, they'll bury their placenta after a baby is born. Some of the previous era, they would have called this a birthing tree, which is actually where women would have given birth. But because most women give birth in hospitals nowadays, some of them will take home the placenta and still bury that. So the theoretic kind of background of that is that where the placenta is buried, then the person should be buried when they pass away. And due to restrictions, this is difficult to happen nowadays. So another thing is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people prefer to be buried whole. So if they can avoid having an amputation, or if they do have to have one, if they can have that body part kept in a frozen state in a morgue, then they would prefer to do that, so that when they actually do pass away, or their whole body can be buried and they will actually be able to travel on to their ancestors. So in Indigenous research project design, and I'm no expert, I'm always going to be somebody who's learning in this area as well, Indigenous perspectives, understanding that the worldview is different to other cultures. So as I said, interconnectedness for Indigenous people is different to a Western culture. There's an entry to the community. It's a protocol that you need to go through. So you need to contact the Land Council or Aboriginal medical centres to discuss the research project and how it is that you could come to the community to meet the elders and discuss that research with them. So there's also an insider-outsider status that is something you need to consider. So even if you are a member of the community, this can also put you in a difficult position with other members within that community, especially if you're from different mobs, and knowing some sort of information about each other that maybe isn't the protocol in that area. So that's something else that you need to consider. But if you're coming in and you aren't Aboriginal, then that probably is another issue that you need to organise to have people who are Indigenous as part of the research team to help to show that you are genuine in your research outcomes with Aboriginal people. So using Indigenous knowledge methods, so such things as yarning with people, or the yarning circle, which is a group, and just allowing people to discuss things. General protocols in Indigenous research should introduce yourself in the Aboriginal way, so that people understand where you're from, who your people are, your relatives, your mob, and they can probably, a lot of people at least know someone who's from your family, even if you aren't from their country or their lands. So you need to listen and understand the history of the community and the impact that this has had on the members of the community as well, and also acknowledge that there could be a potential power imbalance. So as being a researcher, you may be seen as having more intellectual capabilities than some people in the community just because you work at a research institute or you're part of an academic area. That's not to say that you are any more powerful in that situation, just that some people might perceive you in that way. So you need to acknowledge that that exists and certainly include other people within your research so that it's collaborative. So in my research project, I've been able to utilise the connections that I've made in communities to go and yarn with community members about this topic. I also received an ANZ SBT grant, so an Australian New Zealand Society for Blood Transfusion grant to undertake the research. However, as most of us know, COVID's changed the plans for my research and many of my fellow researchers. So then we had to utilise new ways of doing the research and also be very, very patient. So decided to not just have discussions with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, decided to include stakeholders, so health professionals who work with Indigenous patients, and that was easier in some ways to do because it's easy to do an interview or a yarn with that person over a digital platform, whereas when I would travel to communities, it took a lot of time to build up relationships and trust within the community before people would start talking to me about blood, because it's such a sensitive topic. So that's been a challenge, not only COVID, but also being able to travel or not being able to travel, as the case may be. So the participants in my project needed to self-identify as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, needed to be over 18 years of age, and also accepted in the community in which they live. For stakeholders, it was quite simple. Health professionals who have previously had an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander patient load and wanted to discuss the research with me and be a participant. So these are some of the prompts that I used with the participants and adjusted them as the conversation would go on with the person. So not all of them were relevant, and that was, it's challenging to think on your feet whilst you're discussing such a sensitive topic with people, and there were some options there that we wanted to discuss picture prompts with people, but I didn't think that some people would feel comfortable if that was the case. I'm glad that I didn't, because a few of the participants that I actually spoke with do faint at the sight of blood, which was quite surprising that I hadn't actually thought about that part of it either. So and then at the end I just asked if they had any questions about blood, and they wanted to ask me. If I didn't know the answer to their question, then I would get back to them to discuss that with them at some point when I had an answer. So for health practitioners, the topics that I discussed was, have they ever had a patient who refused a blood test? How did they handle that? Did they have an understanding of cultural safety? What the training was that they'd been provided with in their employment? How or whether that cultural safety training included anything to deal with blood, or the thoughts that Aboriginal people might have about blood. Most of them said that they certainly didn't have anything to do with blood in that cultural safety training. So far I've had about 12 health practitioners, so it's a little more than what we were anticipating in the research, so that's been a good thing. And hopefully that this, the information that I've found will actually add to the current information available, which is very minimal. So these are some of the thoughts that people have come back to me with. And one of the things is connection to themselves and their country, their people. But as I indicated before, the previous poor treatment of Aboriginal people has been passed down from generation to generation, and some families really will avoid going to a hospital at all costs. Oftentimes they turn up with a family member who's very ill, and it's a tragedy to see that this poor treatment is now still influencing Aboriginal people today. So they'd also like some education around what their blood tests are that they're having done. Why do they need to have so many tubes collected? And then obviously there was another question, or another suggestion, was that they could have an Aboriginal blood bank so that they knew who the blood was coming from. They'd feel more comfortable if they had to have a transfusion, if they knew who it was coming from. As I've said, there's a couple of challenges with that. And the people that had a transfusion had no actual objection to having it done, but some of those people would actually like resources in their language, especially if English was not their first language, and if they could see videos of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people donating blood, then they'd actually really feel more comfortable with that process. So health practitioners, so many of them understand that this treatment of Aboriginal people has caused issues and still affects healthcare today. They hadn't stopped to think about that they should explain the amount of blood in the body compared to the amount taken at a blood test to the patients who had expressed a concern to them about how many tubes that the pathology people had used. They also didn't realise that maybe there should be more of an explanation and conversation around what the blood tests are that they're requesting and the importance of them and why they're needing to have them done. And they also understood that there was a need to have resources in language for patients, especially those who don't speak English, or the ones who are in a hospital facility without family members who do speak English and Indigenous language as well, that it would help with the interpretation of that procedure. So thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, or if you are a health professional, as I've written here, and you'd like to contact me and be a part of my research project, then by all means, please do so. Thank you.